Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Do you know your true worth? Yesterday, my dad sat across from me at the dinner table, surrounded by relatives who pretended not to hear, and told me straight-faced that I should sign my condo over to my sister because, in his words, she's earned it. The sentence landed with the kind of weight that makes you question if you're the one losing your mind or if the whole family is so tangled in favoritism they've stopped caring about reality altogether. For a moment I just looked at him, watching the fork in his hand hover like this was a normal dinner and not the moment where he asked me to erase years of saving, planning, and grinding just to hand it all over because he decided my sister deserved it more. The first thought I had wasn't even anger, it was disbelief. I bought that condo with my own money, made the down payment from years of skipping vacations, working late nights, and fixing my own busted car instead of trading up. My sister Madison never put in a cent toward it, never showed up to paint a wall, never helped me fight through the paperwork when the mortgage officer buried me in conditions. Yet here was my dad, saying with the calm certainty of someone who had already rehearsed it 100 times that my home should be hers. He dressed it up as fairness, said she had been there for the family, and while I was busy with my career, she had stepped up. Those were his words, but even as he spoke them, I could feel they were hollow, the kind of language you use to make a theft sound like a gift. My mom shifted in her seat, eyes darting between us, but she didn't speak. That told me enough. She had heard this pitch before, probably more than once, and either hadn't fought it or had given up trying. Madison gave me this look, half pity, half entitlement, like she thought this was already settled and my signature was just a formality. When I didn't answer right away, my dad leaned in and said, "She's earned it." He didn't explain how. He didn't give examples of what she had done, because there were none. He just repeated the phrase, like saying it enough times would make it true. I asked a simple question, earned how? That one word cracked the surface. Madison stammered something about helping Dad with family stuff, and then she let slip a detail she shouldn't have, something about talking to the lender about refinancing. I froze because I had never spoken to her about my lender, never even given her the name. How would she know? Dad jumped in quickly, tried to smooth it over, but I caught the twitch in his voice. My chest tightened, not from fear but from the realization that this wasn't just talk around a dinner table. They had been making moves, quiet ones, in the background, as if my life was theirs to rearrange. The rest of the dinner blurred. I remember nodding, keeping my face neutral, asking 2 or 3 more short questions, all calm. What payments has she made on my place? Silence. What repairs has she funded? More silence. My relatives chewed their food with exaggerated interest, pretending they weren't listening, but everyone was hanging on the answers that never came. I could feel the heat of their discomfort pressing against me, but I stayed still. My father finished the conversation by saying, "Think about it. It's what's best for the family." That word family was his shield. He used it like a hammer to nail people into obedience. When I got into the car afterward, I sat for a minute in the dark. My phone buzzed with a text from Nate, my boyfriend, who had been quiet through the whole dinner. He wrote, "You don't have to defend yourself. You know that, right?" That one line cut through the fog. He was right. I didn't owe anyone an argument. I didn't owe them explanations for why the place I bought with my own money was mine. I realized right then that if I stayed passive, they would twist silence into consent. By the time the Uber reached my condo, my decision was already forming. I walked in, sat at my desk, and pulled up my accounts. First, I froze my credit, just in case someone decided to get creative. Then I added property alerts tied to my condo's title so that any attempt to touch it would ping me. I sent a quick message to the building manager to change the access codes on the front door and revoke every spare key that was floating around, even the ones I had stupidly handed to my mom years ago. It was late, but I didn't care. I felt like the ground had shifted under me, and if I didn't act fast, I'd wake up to find my name scrubbed off the deed. And then it happened, the notification. At almost midnight, my phone buzzed with an alert from the title monitor. Someone had pulled a soft inquiry tied to my property address last week. It wasn't me. That was the moment my stomach dropped and the anger crystallized into something else entirely. This wasn't just my dad's dinner table fantasy. This was already in motion. I sat back in my chair, staring at that notification, and I knew two things with absolute clarity. First, they weren't going to stop unless I made them. Second, I wasn't about to lose everything I had built just because my father decided his favorite daughter should have it. And as much as I hated the thought, I realized I would need to fight this not with emotions, not with yelling, but with the kind of precision that leaves no door open for excuses. The question running through my mind wasn't, how could they do this to me? It was, what else have they already done? And I knew I was about to find out. By morning, the shock felt less like a slap and more like a pattern I could finally see, the kind of pattern you only recognize after years of shrugging off small favors that turned into permanent obligations. And as I made coffee, I caught myself counting the times I had been asked to do something just for now that somehow became the new normal while everyone pretended it was still temporary. Which is how you wake up and realize your own life has been quietly rented out under your name. I opened my laptop and pulled old statements because if someone had tugged at my property file, then I needed to know how many threads they had already been weaving, and I started with the simplest thing. The autopay I had set up for Madison once upon a crisis that was supposed to last a month, maybe two at most, a small safety net while she recovered from a job change, yet in my records the transfers marched on for almost a year like clockwork. Tiny sums that do not scream but add up in the end each. Labeled with that soft phrase, family emergency, and seeing them lined up that way made my stomach turn because it was never an emergency, it was expectation dressed as kindness. I called my mom first because I wanted one clean answer before this turned into a war, and she picked up with a sigh that sounded older than she is, told me not to escalate, told me your father has a plan, told me Madison is sensitive, told me the family needs peace, a whole chorus of sentences that never mention my name except as the one who should be reasonable, and for a second I almost slid back into the role I have always played, the calm one who absorbs the blow and pays the bill, the daughter who can take a hit without making a scene because making a scene would be unkind. But then I remembered the alert on my phone at midnight and I heard myself say, very evenly, that any future conversation about my property would be in writing. She went quiet, and in that silence I finally understood that quiet was exactly the problem, because quiet is where the paperwork grows teeth. Nate asked what the plan was, and I told him the plan was boring on purpose. Because boring is how you win against people who think feelings outrank forms, so I called a real estate attorney who came recommended by a coworker who went through a messy inheritance. And when Avery picked up, she listened without drama, asked for dates and names, wrote faster than I could talk, and then laid out a path that sounded like I had been waiting my whole life to hear it. Lock your credit, which I had done. File your homestead declaration so any forced transfer becomes a fantasy. Record a simple notice so title companies know that no agent or relative can speak for you, and if the pressure keeps coming, place the condo into a trust where you hold the steering wheel and make anyone who wants access show their face in daylight. None of it was theatrical, none of it vengeful, all of it solid, and something in me unclenched because I realized I did not have to win an argument, I just had to close the doors they had been trying to slip through. At lunch, my cousin's birthday put me back in a room with people who love the idea of family more than the practice, and I watched how the story moved when I did not feed it, how my father smiled too widely and said we would settle that condo thing soon. How a few aunts repeated the script about sacrifice, and how I had always been so independent that I did not need much, as if independence disqualifies you from fairness, and I felt that old heat in my chest, but kept it down because heat has never moved them, paper does. I pulled a thin folder from my bag and slid a single page across to my dad, a ledger I printed that morning with every temporary transfer I had made in the last few years, nothing accusatory. Just dates and amounts and the little memo notes that I wrote to myself as a reminder, and when he glanced at it and pushed it back with a shrug, saying those were small and I was making a big deal out of nothing, I recognized the move. Minimize, delay, repeat. And soon you will doubt your own memory. I did not argue. I excused myself to the sidewalk, emailed Avery, and within the hour I had the homestead document drafted, ready for recording. along with a brief notice to any title search that no conveyance or encumbrance of my property would be recognized without my notarized consent, and, while the party cut cake, I walked 2 blocks to a notary, signed, scanned, and sent certified copies to the lender and the association, a small storm of paper that said in legal breath what I could not make them herein. Plain speech, which is that my home is not a group project. On the way back, I allowed myself one small, bitter laugh at the idea that I was overreacting, because if this was overreaction, then what do we call a midnight inquiry on a home that is not yours? That evening, I wrote an email to my father and Madison that was short and steady, said that all communication about my property going forward must be in writing and addressed to me, that I would not entertain in-person requests or side conversations, and that any attempt to contact my lender or association on my behalf would be considered interference. I copied Avery because I wanted a witness, and because I am done with he said she said after dinners where everyone pretends they did not hear what they heard. I expected a fast reply, maybe anger, maybe guilt, but what came instead was silence so loud it felt like planning. Avery called just before bed, her voice level, and said one more thing that made my skin prickle. Pull your old credit from the year Madison got her first car, because the dealership and the timing you mentioned are not sitting right with me. And if there is an application in your name that you did not authorize, we need to request the original documents before anyone decides to lose them. I thanked her, closed my eyes, and pictured that old afternoon when my dad handed me a stack of forms and said sign here for a better insurance rate for the family, and in that image my name slid across a blank line I did not read because I trusted him. And now I felt the ground tilt under me, not from fear, but from the sense that the map of this whole story was about to redraw itself. When I finally pulled the full credit history from the year Madison got her first car, I expected maybe a stray inquiry or a harmless error that could be explained away. But what I found staring back at me on the screen was an actual closed personal loan with my name tied to it, dated the very same month my dad had made me sign what he called insurance papers for the family. And the realization sank in slowly that this had not been a slip or a one-time misunderstanding, but a deliberate use of my identity, and if it happened once, then it could have happened more times than I dared to imagine. The dealership inquiry was still there too, and while it had been marked closed, the detail that broke me was that the mailing address associated with the loan had been my parents' house, not mine, which meant the paperwork and the notices never even touched my hands. And every red flag that should have gone off back then had been neatly rerouted away from me, so I would never know. I sat with that for hours, scrolling through documents, checking dates, lining them up with the times I remembered my dad saying we needed to help Madison get a good start, or take the pressure off her. And each time the same image replayed in my mind of him sliding papers in front of me, casual, fatherly, almost annoyed that I even looked at the lines before signing. And I realized he had been using my trust as collateral long before the condo became the target. What stung more than the financial risk was the way my family had treated my willingness to help as a resource to be mined, a bottomless well they could draw from whenever Madison stumbled, and then dress it up later as evidence that she was earning something through sacrifice, when the only sacrifice being made had been mine, hidden under layers of silence. I called Avery again, and this time my voice shook not from fear but from the cold rage of seeing my own signature where it did not belong, and she did not flinch or offer sympathy. She simply said that this was exactly why she had advised me to move fast. Because fraud left unchallenged becomes fact on paper, and fact on paper is what wins when feelings and memory are contested. She laid out the next steps as if she had walked this road with 100 other clients before me. Place a fraud alert across all bureaus, demand the wet ink copies of any loan documents, and prepare a sworn statement rescinding any signature obtained without informed consent, which sounds clinical but carries real teeth if someone tries to lean on it later. I did every step before the day ended, moving like someone who knew hesitation would only invite more damage, and by the time the alerts were active and the requests were sent, I felt for the first time that I had wrestled back even a sliver of control. The next move was the trust, and though the paperwork was tedious and full of clauses I barely understood, Avery explained each piece patiently, showing me how a simple land trust would remove my condo from the direct line of fire, placing it in an entity where I was the trustee and the beneficiary, with a successor clause that could only be changed by me, which meant that no relative, no parent, not even a spouse could ever claim a backdoor right to it. Recording the memorandum of trust felt like locking a door that had been swinging wide open for years, and while it did not erase what they had already done with my name, it meant that from this point forward the game would not be played in shadows or on my silence. When I sent the email to my dad and Madison that night, my words were measured, but sharp enough to leave no confusion. Any future contact about my property must be in writing. All attempts to approach my lender or association would be documented and treated as interference, and any past actions that used my information without authorization were already under review. I copied Avery again, not because I wanted to intimidate them, but because I wanted the chain of evidence to be airtight, and I knew my dad well enough to expect his next move would be to paint me as hysterical, unreasonable, or ungrateful. Silence followed, the kind of silence that is not surrender but strategy, and I braced myself for the spin that would come when he finally chose his words. 2 days later, the dealership mailed me copies of the old application, and when I tore open the envelope and held the papers in my hand, my stomach lurched. The signature line carried my name, neat and fluid, but the handwriting was not mine. The loops, the slant, even the pressure of the pen were wrong, and I stared at it long enough for my eyes to water, not because I doubted the forgery, but because the thought of who had held the pen made me sick. It had to have been my father, maybe even in the room with Madison, filling in the blanks of my life like it was a harmless family workaround, never once considering that it was theft of more than money, it was theft of my ability to decide for myself. Holding that document made everything click into place. Every strange look from my mother, every slip of detail from Madison, every time my father leaned on the word family to silence questions, and I felt something harden in me that was not going to soften again. If they wanted to rewrite history, then I would give them new chapters they could not erase, and I understood that my revenge was not going to be loud or violent but slow, deliberate, and executed with the same kind of paperwork they had once used to trap me. The paper trail was finally in my hands, and I was ready to turn it into a weapon. When the envelope with the dealership paperwork landed in my mailbox, I thought I had already braced myself for whatever it might contain, but holding it in my hands at the next family lunch changed everything. Because it was no longer a suspicion that something shady had happened behind my back, it was undeniable evidence with ink, handwriting, and dates that lined up perfectly with the evening my father had told me to sign papers for insurance rates. The timing of that lunch had been carefully chosen, not by accident but by design, because I invited 2 of my aunts who had always believed my father's narrative about sacrifice and fairness. The ones who clucked sympathetically when he described me as too career-focused and too self-sufficient, and I wanted them present not because I expected support, but because I wanted an audience when the story collapsed under its own weight. I had rehearsed how I would play it, calm and deliberate, because if I walked in swinging accusations, then everyone would fold into the same defensive posture and call me bitter. So instead, I passed around the pages like I was sharing photographs. And when my aunts began reading and saw my name scrawled in handwriting that clearly was not mine, they exchanged the kind of looks that told me this was new information for them too, the kind of looks that said doubt was seeping into cracks they had never considered before. My father tried to seize control instantly, waving it off as a small thing and saying everyone does that when family needs help, but his voice had that tight edge, the one that betrays when he knows the script is slipping. Madison could not resist adding her own line, saying it was only a boost, just something small to help her qualify, but in saying that she confessed more than she realized, because you cannot need a boost unless someone else is carrying the load for you. I could have stopped there and let the weight of the papers speak for itself, but I wanted no chance for the narrative to twist back later into confusion or denial, so I took out my phone, pressed play on a short recording, and let the sound of my father's own voice fill the room. He was on speaker from a recent call, clear and undeniable, admitting that he had borrowed my name for a better rate when Madison could not qualify and explaining casually that I would not miss the condo, because I was capable enough to buy another one. The room went still. Even the clinking of cutlery stopped. For years my relatives had nodded along to the idea that I was strong and independent and therefore owed more, that my strength meant I could absorb the unfairness, but now they were forced to hear that strength twisted into justification for theft. Not generosity. My father sputtered about context, claimed it was private talk taken out of proportion, but the damage was done because my aunts now had something undeniable, his voice and the forged signature, side by side, both pointing to the same truth. Madison's face flushed deep red, and instead of denying it, she chose a different tactic, snapping at me that I always had to play the victim, that the condo was just a place, and that family comes first. That line, meant to shame me back into silence, was exactly what I needed because it exposed the thinking behind everything. They believed my independence meant I should be the bank, the guarantor, the one who absorbed losses so others could keep their illusions intact. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply opened my email app in front of them, attached the recording and the scanned documents, and forwarded them directly to the lender's fraud department with Avery copied. Then, without a single ounce of hesitation, I forwarded the same packet to the family group thread under the subject, Clarification of Boundaries and Property. I blind copied my two aunts who were sitting across from me so that, even if the group thread tried to delete or minimize, there would be outside witnesses who knew the truth firsthand. That was the moment I felt a shift in the air, not because anyone spoke in my defense, but because the silence that followed was not complicit silence anymore. It was stunned, cornered silence. The rest of the lunch crawled forward awkwardly, with plates barely touched and glances darting around the table, but I did not care about their discomfort, because for once I was not the one carrying the weight of keeping things polite, and it was not my job to shield them from the consequences of their choices. I excused myself early, stood up calmly, and walked out while they sat frozen, and in that walk I felt lighter than I had in years, not because the fight was over, but because I had finally shifted the battleground from whispered obligations and twisted guilt into the open air of facts and documents. That evening my phone buzzed with a message from my father, written with his usual commanding tone, telling me I was overreacting and inviting me to dinner the next day, so we could fix this if I signed. The arrogance of that line made me laugh out loud, because he still believed the solution to being caught was to double down on the demand, as if the evidence I had laid on the table would vanish if he insisted loudly enough. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed my reply with steady hands. I will be there. And for the first time I was not going to dinner as the dutiful daughter, but as someone who had already set the pieces for the final move, and all that was left was to play it. The following evening I walked into my parents' house knowing exactly how the night would unfold, because I had already decided that this was not going to be another ambush where I sat pinned to my chair while my father delivered pronouncements disguised as advice and my mother stared down at her plate as if silence was a form of loyalty. The dining table was set just as it had been at every family gathering, with Madison already sitting comfortably in my old chair, and for a fleeting second I felt the old sting of being erased even in the smallest gestures. But instead of shrinking, I let the sight harden me. My father began the performance almost immediately, leaning back as if he were the arbiter of some courtroom, saying in his practiced voice that this would be easier if I simply acknowledged what everyone already knew. That Madison had earned the right to my condo by being the one who cared most for the family when I was busy chasing a career. His tone was calm, but every word was sharpened to wound, as if repeating the same lie long enough would finally make it feel like truth. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted his arrogance fully recorded in the memory of every relative present. When he finished his speech, I placed a folder on the table and slid it across with steady hands. Inside were the trust documents, notarized statements, the fraud case numbers from the lender, and the rescission of signatures that had been misused in my name. I told him clearly that the condo was now held in trust, immune from his schemes, and that any attempt to interfere further would no longer be a family dispute, but a legal matter with consequences he could not charm or bully his way out of. Madison scoffed, trying to play it off as theatrics, but when she flipped through the pages her face paled, because even she could see that what had once been a soft, malleable story had hardened into fact. stamped and recorded in ways that not even my father could undo. The room was tense, but I did not stop there. I pulled out one final sheet, a lease agreement signed with a nonprofit that placed women recovering from financial abuse into stable housing, and I explained calmly that whenever I was away traveling for work, the condo would not sit empty or be dangled as bait for someone else's entitlement. Instead, it would house women who were fighting to reclaim their lives, and the rent they paid would cover upkeep while giving me peace of mind. My father sputtered that this was unnecessary, that I was being vindictive, but I leaned forward and said the words that had been sitting on my tongue since the first dinner. Strange, isn't it? Worry less about your favorite, she doesn't belong to you. I let the sentence linger in the air, heavy and cutting, because it was not just about Madison or the condo. It was about years of being treated like a resource instead of a daughter, and I wanted them to hear it in full. The silence that followed was not the kind that begged for reconciliation. It was the silence of a truth too sharp to be covered with small talk. My mother whispered if I would ever forgive them, and for the first time I answered with honesty instead of a polite deflection. Not today, I said, and I meant it. I gathered the papers, stood up, and walked away without waiting for permission to leave, because the permission had always been a leash I never needed in the first place. As I stepped outside into the cool night, my phone buzzed again, but this time it was not another demand or manipulation. It was Avery's message confirming that the fraud department had opened a full investigation into the forged loan, and that any future attempt to use my information would trigger alerts I could act on instantly. That small confirmation grounded me, because it meant the fight was no longer invisible, no longer a lonely battle of memory against denial. It was real, documented, and visible to people who had no stake in the family drama except to enforce the law. Driving home, I realized I had not just saved a condo, I had taken back my name, my choices, and my independence from people who believed they could rewrite the rules whenever it suited them. The victory was not loud or cinematic, but it was permanent, and it left me with a kind of relief that tasted sharper than joy, because I knew the cost of winning was the final fracture with my family. Yet, even as I thought about the fallout, I felt no regret. For the first time in years, I was not asking myself how to make them proud, how to keep the peace, or how to carry the weight of their expectations. I was asking myself what I wanted, and the answer was simple: freedom from their grip. That night, as I locked the door of my condo and walked through each room knowing that no one could take it from me, I let out a long breath I had been holding for years. The walls, the keys, the title, and even the lease agreement for strangers who needed shelter were all mine, not in the sense of ownership alone, but in the deeper sense of control. I was no longer the daughter who signed forms blindly, no longer the sister who was told to give up what she earned, no longer the woman expected to sacrifice because she could. I was the woman who said no, who held her ground, who turned their tricks into evidence, and who ended the cycle with a single, undeniable truth. She won, and this time the story could not be rewritten.